we are venturing officially into Hammerland. I am very excited to do this, especially with you,
Thanks.
Dr. AC, Mr. Aaron Christensen of Horror 101 with Dr. AC. You've been my guide on several movies, genres from giallo to Hammer. We've done a few episodes about Hammer films, and we've decided to take the full plunge this year. We've got a whole slate covering specifically the Hammer films of Dracula and Frankenstein. We've talked a few Dracula movies, but not anything regarding Frankenstein, and that's why I'm very excited to talk about 1957's The Curse of Frankenstein, starring Peter Cushing as Victor Frankenstein and Christopher Lee as the creature, not the monster. He's credited as the creature. Was this the first Hammer monster movie, or where does this fit into the filmography?
So yeah, the thing is, like, there is a fair amount of context in which this film needs to be nested. Um, so Hammer had first kind of explored the sci-fi horror realm in 1955 with the Quatermass experiment. Sorry, Quatermass experiment, and that was based off of a Nigel Neal teleplay on BBC, and they did a feature film version of it because they noticed that the pubs were empty because everybody was home listening to the radio or watching the TV program, and so it was a big hit. And so when it was released, it was a big hit as a film because the United States wasn't familiar with the BBC program. They titled it The Creeping Unknown. It's kind of like a blob movie. And so they wanted to not, if you called it Quatermass, it wouldn't mean anything the way it meant something to the BBC audience. Anyway, so they had toyed around with a few more of those. They did another Quatermass film, then they did another blob movie called X the Unknown. And this was their first venture. All of those were black and white. And this was their first venture into a color horror film. And they chose the Frankenstein film because Milton Subotsky and Max Rosenberg, who would later become famous for doing all of the Amicus anthology films like Tales from the Crypt, what are some other ones, like Asylum, From Beyond the Grave, Dr. Terror's House of Horrors. Like there's these collections but they also did feature films like Now the Screaming Starts and The Beast Must Die, etc. So anyway, they came to Hammer because Hammer was starting to kind of venture into these genre grounds, and they brought a Frankenstein, the concept of a Frankenstein film, and it was going to be told from the standpoint of the Baron reflecting on his experiments in a jail cell awaiting death. But the screenplay proved to be more, it was much more elaborate and covered a lot more ground. And Hammer being a thrifty company, a small movie studio, they found that vision was too extravagant, but they liked the idea of doing a Frankenstein film. And as soon as they floated the idea of doing one, they were immediately met by Universal, who said, if you do anything that resembles our classic 1931, especially the look of the monster, Jack Pierce's design and Karloff's performance, we will slap you with so many lawsuits that you won't know what to do with yourself. And so that was the challenge that was posed to Jimmy Sangster, who's credited with the screenplay. He and Anthony Nelson Keys, the executive producer, associate producer, worked on it together. But Jimmy Sangster is credited with the screenplay because his big light bulb moment was, we're going to make the Baron the monster instead of his creation. And so that was their brainstorm, and it turned out to be wildly successful for them because they found Peter Cushing to play Baron Frankenstein. And Cushing had just started to enjoy some real celebrity working in television. They had the BBC, it was called, it was the BBC Sunday Night Theater. And basically they would do plays, live TV, you know, full movie, you know, as you went. And Peter Cushing was in many of them, and he reached a certain degree of celebrity with his performance as Winston Smith in George Orwell's 1984.
Oh, wow.
That was 1954 was when he did that. And that kind of brought him in and made him a household name.
Do you know if that is available anywhere?
It is available. You can find it online. And I think you can also find it on physical media as well.
I got to check that out. That's great.
And it is great. He's terrific in it. So they found Cushing, and, you know, it was Cushing's first film with Hammer. And it began an association with the studio that would last through the rest of his life.
You know,
so yeah, and sorry, just let me to put a pin on that. Is
sure.
that he, with Cushing in place as a known star, things were able to move forward. You had a script and you had a star, and so everything else was going to fall in place.
That's all really incredible because, you know, watching this, I mean, he was an actor, he was an established, you know, actor in some right, but just to know that this was his breakout kind of big screen performance, and to see what he brought to it. I mean, we've talked about some of the Dracula films that he's been in as Van Helsing, and I remember you kind of teasing me by saying, "Oh, just wait till you see him play a villain." I was like, "Okay," I was not ready for what I watched. I just finished this like an hour ago, and was swept up with this notion that I've seen something I've sort of been waiting for my entire life. It is a perfect, brutal villain performance, but he doesn't play it insane. He plays it obsessive.
Yes.
And you can kind of understand where he's coming from. He's an asshole and he's an obsessive. So you don't even need madness in there. He's just, you know, you believe he's so egomaniacal that he would seek to create life from nothing instead of creating life the natural way, which, you know, we'll get to in a little bit. But it was just such a beautiful performance surrounded by, you know, Terence Fisher, who we've talked about as well. Some brilliant direction. Those Hammer sets that we've talked about, you know, it doesn't have those giant, vibrant, popping colors, at least not in the streaming version that I rented from Hoopla. Maybe the Blu-ray is a bit different, but I did love the elaborate sets, and, you know, more so the sets than the costumes. But I would love to visit that lab and just walk around. It reminded me of the lab from The Fly. It's just, it's all beautiful. And for a movie that's like, it's not even an hour and a half long, I got the complete drama and the horror and the surprises that I don't get from, you know, modern films that are twice that length.
Yeah. And I think you can see why George Lucas might have said he might make a really good Grand Moff Tarkin. Which I feel like, I mean, most people, I would say, you know, 40 and younger, that was their experience with Peter Cushing, was seeing him as Grand Moff Tarkin in the Star Wars movies.
That was mine, certainly.
Yeah, and I had only stumbled onto him in a later Hammer Frankenstein installment, Frankenstein Must Be Destroyed, on a Creature Features. So I had a fleeting glimpse of who he was, but I was like, okay, I see Star Wars, you know, 10 times. He's Grand Moff Tarkin to me. But having now seen him as Baron Frankenstein and Van Helsing, that's who he is to me. And I'm like, and he also did that Star Wars movie.
I kind of felt the same way at the end of this movie, because the Hammer stuff that I've seen of his is so much more powerful. You know, Tarkin's also a minor character in the original Star Wars, minor, but he has a, you know, tremendous impact as far as his performance. But first of all, we got to talk about this origin story of Victor Frankenstein. This takes place in Switzerland. It's based on a Swiss legend. Young Victor Frankenstein's mother has just passed away, leaving him with untold, millions of Swiss francs or dollars or whatever they had back then. He's got an aunt who was on the mom's payroll, who has a daughter, Elizabeth, who is then Frankenstein's cousin. And as he's escorting her out the house, saying, "Don't worry, I'll still pay you the money that my mom paid you on the first of the month," she's like, "Oh yes, and darling Elizabeth, she'd like to come by and visit. She's going to make someone very happy one day." And I immediately thought, okay, are they actually cousins, or is this like an adopted kid situation? Because that's creepy. Turns out, yeah, the cousins are the love interest in this movie. What's going on there?
Oh, that's just, old timey, gotta keep it in the family. I mean,
No.
I think that wasn't uncommon back then, just like historically speaking. And that's why you had a lot of inbreeding and, people who didn't turn out quite right.
I get it, maybe from a purely historical context, but it just seems like a weird detail to include in a in a screenplay and not address it. Like nobody, not even Paul, the best friend slash mentor, says, "Well, you're engaged." He mentions it as a, you can't, when he's talking to Elizabeth, you can't marry him because he's an obsessed and all that stuff. Doesn't even
Right.
bring up the cousin thing.
But
I'm sure he's aware of it.
but I don't think it was an issue back then. I mean, I think that it was kind of, just taken for granted that of course you're going to keep it in the family. You don't want to let it go somewhere else.
Ugh. Um, so it's possible they could have ended up with a child like Frankenstein
There you
without
go.
any grave digging.
No working at all.
But so yeah, it is kind of a fascinating story because Victor meets Paul, a tutor who he is sent for. Paul assumes that he was contacted by an adult, but it turns out it was just this like 15-year-old kid or how old he's supposed to be. The money's good, and Victor is a fascinating, subject. So they develop a working relationship. And long after, quote unquote, Victor learned everything Paul had to teach him in 2 years. He's a super genius, little Lex Luthor kid. They become partners in exploring the further realms of science, and they resurrect a dog in the lab. And Paul is like, "Great, we're going to take this to the medical community. They're meeting next month. This is going to be huge." And Victor's like, "No, we'll do it next year because this is not as far as I want to go before we release our secret to the world. I want to do people." And Paul's like, "Record scratch, what?" And thus begins the real rift in their friendship. Elizabeth comes to stay with them. They're to be married. Another wonderful detail, and it just underlines Frankenstein's bastardry, almost literally, is he's also stooping the maid, the lovely Justine. Um, it's like the screenplay is going out of its way to make this guy as despicable as possible, but also possibly through the power of Cushing's performance, so charismatic that you can't help but kind of be in love with him too.
Well, and I think it's to Jimmy Sangster's credit, because again, in the idea of keeping it efficient, almost all of the story takes place at the Frankenstein estate. There are a couple of shots outside in the countryside, but for the most part, everything happens in one location. And you'll see that happen in Horror of Dracula as well. Instead of going from Transylvania to England and back and forth, he locates the all the action in a place where people can get to each other within a horse ride. So yeah, and you did a great job of kind of encapsulating how things roll. It's also worth noting that the movie starts with a priest coming to visit Frankenstein in a jail cell. So we have an inherent sense that things did not necessarily go well for the Baron. And he wants to have the priest, he calls for the priest so that he can make his confession, not so he can be, accepted into the heavens, but so that somebody knows the truth of his story.
Well, here's the other thing, and I don't know if it's because I was really tired when I started watching this movie, or if it's just the power of the filmmaking, because at the very end of the film, once we've had the resolution of the monster, spoiler alert, he falls to his death, a spectacular death. uh, and Elizabeth also appears to have been mortally wounded. We're like, okay, so what of Frankenstein? When it cuts back to that prison cell, which is more like a cave, like a dungeon,
Mhm.
I had completely forgotten that that's where we began. And I had this wonderful moment of like, oh, right. That's, because when we first meet Frankenstein as a prisoner, he is unrecognizable, even as any incarnation of Peter Cushing that I've seen. He's
Mm.
disheveled. He's, pale, dripping with sweat. He's got this gross kind of like beard, crazy man hair. And he's completely freaked out. And to go from the suave Victor Frankenstein, who at the end of this movie is quite, stressed, but he's still dapper, to this thing that lives in a cave now, it was a shock, compounded by what happens later when Paul comes to visit him,
Right.
compounded even further by the closing moment of the film, which I don't quite want to spoil, but it's a wonderful image that plays out behind the credits.
Yep. And we're gonna see more of that in installments to come.
More of that.
More of that. I'm not going to say anything further.
Okay. All right, good. But no, it's just one of those things where the movie builds up a certain head of steam, and then it barrels on through the climax, not only with cool set pieces and moments of horror, but with some tremendous ideas and questions. But then in those final moments, you really don't quite know what to expect. There's a betrayal. There is the doctor's ultimate fate, which, again, without spoiling anything, it's just terrific and horrific to imagine. But it also leaves open a question, which is we don't quite see what we think we're going to see. And I don't know, I haven't seen the
Mm.
rest of these films, so maybe it is not meant to be set up for a sequel, but it felt like it could be.
Mm. Yeah. I mean, um, I feel like there's a great kind of sense of finality to this one. Now, obviously, knowing that there are future installments to come, hence us having programmed an entire year around it,
Yeah.
you're like, well, okay, I guess this is the end with a question mark instead of the end.
Well, or because we've seen this with the other Hammer films, the Dracula series, with Peter Cushing showing up as Van Helsing, there are connective bits of threads between these movies, but it
Yes,
doesn't explicitly come out and say, this is, not in all cases, this is a sequel to that other film that we talked about. It's
right,
sort of like in this, it's almost like the further wacky adventures of, Van Helsing.
right.
Rather than a Marvel Cinematic Universe kind of thing where everything is connected down to the
Every
buttons. Yeah.
dot has every dot I has been dotted. Now, you and I are coming at this film from very different points of view. I've seen it many times, and it actually I realized it had been probably 10 years since I'd been back to it, so it was very much like coming back to an old friend. Um, it sounds like you enjoyed it.
I loved it. Yeah.
So for me, sitting down to it again, knowing what lies ahead, knowing that we're on a journey, and always having known that I was on a journey, um, but I was sitting there and I'm watching just even the opening credits because again, this was the first real Hammer horror effort, and the first color horror film for them. And as I'm watching the screen, the opening credits, and I'm seeing names like Cushing, seeing names like Lee, seeing names like Hazel Court, Valerie Gaunt. Um, you had Terence Fisher, Jimmy Sangster, Roy Asher, the cinematographer, Phil Leakey is the makeup man, Bernard Robinson doing the sets, James Needs is the editor, Hollingsworth and Bernard on the music, Anthony Hines, Anthony Nelson Keys. It's like you're just seeing all of these names that they're not familiar to you, but they will become familiar to you over the course of the year. And that's really exciting to me because I'm going, these credits become very familiar to you. And you go, yes, here we are, we're in good hands again. And you can imagine how it was for a British audience, or even, just a monster kid in the 50s and 60s, knowing that, okay, here we are, the gang's back together, and we're going to see another great Hammer horror film. Watching this for the first time, kind of at the beginning of the chapter, it's like there's an excitement as to, okay, these people are together, working together, not for the first time, because, Hammer was a little family. And so, some of them had already worked together on other projects, but this is them getting together for their first real Hammer horror effort, and knowing that from this, we're going to see years and years and years of fantastic genre entertainment.
Well, the cool thing about this is in the probably 3, I think maybe 4 episodes that we've done already on Hammer stuff going back a couple of years. Um, I already recognize some of these names, and that does get me excited. Now, I'm not at the point yet where, I mean, Terence Fisher, obviously,
Sure.
but some of these other names, they're familiar to me, but I'm not like, oh my God, this is gonna be
Right.
great.
Right.
Um, but I do feel that I'm in for a treat because we're exploring these Hammer movies. I gotta say, I'm a big fan of horror. I'm not nearly as steeped in it as you and a number of other friends, but it is always surprising to me when I go back and watch an older film, an older horror film, and I'm shocked because in modern horror, millennial horror, it's like, where else can you go?
Right.
We've seen every bit of viscera and blood and boobs combination and exploding heads and all that, but watching this movie from 1957 and seeing Christopher Lee as this monster, I'd seen, I think, stills of him because it's a famous visage, but I'd never seen him in motion. He's truly frightening. And the scene where he is out in the woods and he happens upon an old blind man and then the blind man's grandson, that whole exchange where there's a degree of malevolence, you get a sense of that in this creature. He's not just this thing that's woken up and he's confused. It seems like it's angry and deliberately lashing out, and it's also kind of mindless. So Lee portrays that really well in his body language. But that whole thing where the blind man, we see them in the frame together, he has no idea what's going on. I almost had the sensation watching this of feeling blind. Like, I know there's danger, but I don't know how this is going to play out. So I might as well just be calling out, like, who's there? Who are you? When that stick gets snapped because the guy's trying to defend himself with the only thing he can grab. And then Frankenstein, the creature comes at the camera, and then later the little boy, and then you just see the satchel. You can just imagine the terrible things that went on. And I was frankly surprised that they showed this in a movie in 1957. I
Hmm.
I have that misguided modern belief that horror only got real back, from like the 1970s onward. But I'm watching this when Frankenstein the creature, sorry, gets shot in the eye with the shotgun, grabs its face, and there's blood pouring out. I'm like, this is the 1950s. What the hell is going on here? So I have a lot to learn, and I'm
Well,
I'm glad to be in this school.
you were not alone in that feeling, because audiences in 1957 were shocked, and that was the intention, I think, on Fisher's part, and everybody involved, was to push the envelope. We wanted to deliver something that had not been seen before and that would grab attention. The critics were appalled. This film got shredded up and down. It was seen as obscene. They called it just completely gratuitous. I mean, it was just every name in the book that you could give it. And of course, audiences ate it up because it was a truly horrific horror film. And again, the idea that color horror was still something that was very much being toyed with. The bigger budget sci-fi efforts had already started to explore color, but we hadn't seen a lot of horror films in color. And so uh, when I look at the lab scenes in particular, like, they're almost like, Bernard Robinson, the production designer, is like, let's go to purple one there and let's do a vial of yellow here. And because it really does feel showy. It feels like, look at all the colors, look at what you've never seen before in a scientist's lab. Um, this predates The Fly by 1 year.
Mm.
And that was done in 58. But I mean, like, the idea of like having big vats of like red, we assume blood, bubbling, and when Cushing, I love when Cushing cuts off the head of the first cadaver and then wipes his lapel very casually, leaving a blood smear. And you're like, it was deliberately shocking. That was the intention. And so yes, you're not alone in going, I can't believe I'm seeing this, because nobody else could either.
Yeah, I mean, there's as far as the different colored liquids, I wonder how much of that was uh if we just photograph this with, water in it or bubbling acid, it's just going to look all the kind of same, like these weird crystal
Right.
vials everywhere. This helps you see what's really going
Absolutely.
on,
Absolutely.
I also love that in the back room there is a giant person-sized and shaped tub just of acid. It's not,
Just about
there's no
if you need to
enclosure.
dispose of things.
Yeah. Yeah, it's like I'm glad he kept that door locked, because I could just imagine.
The
Yikes.
family cat wanders in there, and bye Fifi.
Now, honestly, there was a scene where towards the end where Elizabeth is up on that roof, right above where that acid vat is, and there's a window. I don't know how much of this was a deliberate bit of misdirection or foreshadowing of what was to come, but I thought for sure she was going to fall in there, and that was going to actually make Frankenstein go insane. Like, you killed my wife, cousin. Um,
What did you think of Lee's makeup?
I thought it was great. I mean, I was, it's a high definition, stream, I guess. It probably looks better on the Blu-ray, but I was kind of looking for those seams, and it didn't look cartoonish is the wrong word, but I think about the Evil Dead, the original Evil Dead, and how that makeup looks really kind of pancakey and weird, and just like they used what they had, almost like chemical experiments to make these gashes.
Mhm.
The stuff on Lee's face looked really good, I thought, and was a successful. Like, this looks like a bunch of people who've been butchered and put back together. It's sufficiently horrific. I love the kind of Nosferatu jacket kind of look that he had when you see him out in the daylight for the first time, and he's very stiff, and you got these beautiful black buttons up and down. It was almost like a cross between a vampire and Frankenstein, which,
Mhm.
as a modern, appreciator of this genre, it's cool to see. I don't know if there's any connection back in 1957 when they were putting this together, but it was like a psychic lightning bolt. I'm like, I wasn't expecting this, and I don't quite know how to react. It's like a vampire Frankenstein.
The makeup, again, the Universal had a very strong trademark on the flat head and the bolts in the neck. So they really had to go right from the drawing board. And this was kind of thrown together almost at the last. They tried several different designs, and none of them were really resonating for Fisher. And Phil Leakey finally came up with this one, that milky white eye, and then the various stitchings that were going on, as you said, as though it had been stitched together from a variety of sources. And Lee'd been working for probably about 10 years or so. He was 33 when he made this film.
Wow.
So he'd been working for a while, but because of his height, he was very difficult to kind of cast, because he was towering over everybody, and so he stood out. And so he was working, but only in kind of minor roles and uncredited roles. He had a few supporting parts, and he was given the opportunity to audition for the role because of his height. They wanted somebody who was appropriately unusual, and it was between him and another actor. And because the story goes that the one actor wanted 10 pounds per week, and that Lee was willing to do it for 8 pounds per week. And so for the want of 2 pounds, Lee became an international superstar, and this other actor was never heard from again.
Well, that's, they say, sometimes you got to sacrifice in order to make those big leaps. That's incredible. But yeah, it's also a great performance. The one thing that I thought was missing, and this isn't a detriment to Lee, and not even necessarily to the screenwriter, because it's just something I was thinking of, again, more in that modern context. Frankenstein's creature gets shot in the face, as we mentioned, and dies.
Mm-hmm.
Paul and Victor break up, and in that ensuing breakup, Victor digs up the creature and gets another brain. Now, am I correct in assuming that brain came from Justine, the murdered maid?
He doesn't get another brain.
Well, how did he reanimate the?
He reanimates him, but that's why when the creature is locked up, chained up in the basement, or I'm sorry, not in the basement, but in the other room.
Yeah, it's more of an attic, which is another kind of a twist. You think of these subterranean labs, this
Yeah,
thing's
exactly.
upstairs.
I immediately was saying, no, it's actually upstairs. But that's why his motor movements are so jerky and confused and childlike once he's in the after he's been resurrected for the second time, because he tells Paul, he's like, you're the one who put the bullet in his brain. It's your fault that he is this way. I gave him life and you gave him the damaged brain. Twice.
Yeah. See, I read that. I was picking up because I think it was just before that was the scene where Justine, the maid, is pissed off because Victor announces he's going to move forward not only with the marriage, but that she, the maid, is going to have to cater to, her, I think it refers to her as her mistress, her every need, for in perpetuity. She's like, no, and I also know what you've been up to, or I have an idea, and I'm going to tell people. So that seals her fate. She goes sneaking into the lab. He locks her in the room with the creature, and the creature kills her. Now, the next time we see the creature, or no, was this? Oh, okay. So that's
after.
That's after. Okay. I guess I was getting the time mixed up because for some reason I'd associated with.
I like your idea though, and when I do my Frankenstein film, I'm going to totally put Justine's brain in the creature.
Because maybe I was thinking that something didn't work out and he did another experiment, because when we see him in the dungeon later, his head is partially shaved. So I thought he had gone in and put another brain in there, and I was waiting for the creature to try and talk, and it either not necessarily have her voice, but like kind of have her emotions, like screaming, like, what am I doing in this body? Yeah. Yeah, so that theory goes out the window, but yeah, it is fun. So put that into your Frankenstein script.
I will, for sure. But yes, I think that again, Paul damages let's back up and just, because they get the cadaver and the crows have been at the head of the hanged man. And so they cut the head off. And so now we need to get a new head. And while we're getting a new head, we might as well get a new brain as well. And so they invite one of the esteemed professors, one of the preeminent minds in the world, and invite him over. And then Cushing pushes him over a railing, basically, and kills him. And
that is one of the most spectacular. I don't know how the hell they did that.
Falls is amazing. Yeah, apparently the stuntman. I want to pull up his name just because he probably never gets talked about, and darn it, we'll talk about him here.
Did he actually die? I mean, because that's not a rag doll. That's a full-on down.
The stuntman's name is Jock Easton, and yes, he did actually injure his neck because he was supposed to land on a pad and just missed it, and so that didn't fare well for him. But he didn't die.
So that sound of the skull hitting that might have just been.
That's just.
That wasn't a sound effect. That's just
diegetic sound. But anyway, so yes, he does in fact steal the brain of the professor and is planning to put it into his creature. And Paul, that fuss budget, just gets in the way and ends up damaging the brain before they can put it in.
I love it. There's
why we have a creature with a damaged brain.
That's the name of your Frankenstein movie, by the way. Creature with a damaged brain.
Creature with a damaged brain.
But no, I love that struggle, because once Paul, I think, realizes what is in that bag and what Frankenstein wants to do, they're struggling over it, and you realize it's just a brain in a black like cloth bag. And when it hits the wall, it's not even like a dramatic thing. It's just enough. You're like, oh, that's probably not good anymore.
I wouldn't put that anywhere. Anyway, so yeah, and then of course Paul shoots the creature through the eye. And also, can we just talk about, like, the next time we see the creature, the fact that his milky white eye is now black. It's a jet black eye. I was like, That's brilliant.
It is. It's also
But yeah,
really upsetting to see. Yeah.
yeah, and so Paul just has it in for this poor creature's brain. And what's funny is that Paul Urquhart, who play, or sorry, not Paul. What's his name? Um, do do do. Uh,
See who gets there
Sorry,
first.
Robert Urquhart.
Okay.
Um, he apparently was so repulsed by this film that he disowned it, never did another movie with Hammer, and never did another horror film. So they cast the right guy for this role of Paul because
he's morally opposed to everything going on.
Exactly right. Whereas Cushing, between this and Dracula, he became forever associated with the horror genre and kind of rarely worked outside of it again. But he really embraced that. He said, it's better that I'm able to offer something to the public that they really genuinely enjoy. And if that's my lot, I mean, my goal was to be a working actor, and here I am doing just that.
And that's what I appreciate from everything that I've seen from him, and even Christopher Lee and some of the Dracula stuff what we've seen is, these are fantastic performers who could have done anything, but they worked within this genre. And it's not just that they showed up because, like, well, there's a paycheck in it and people know who I am. It really feels like they committed to it as if it was, Shakespeare on the stage.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm totally in love. I've got a huge movie man crush on Peter Cushing now.
Well,
And we're just beginning, so this is terrific.
He is officially my wife's other boyfriend. She's always called him my boyfriend, Peter Cushing. I did want to just point out, I don't know, have you seen the movie Top Secret?
Yes. And I thought about that in the scene where we
With
see,
the magnifying glass.
yes, Frankenstein with the magnifying glass. I take it that's a direct homage, or is that just a cosmic coincidence? Have the Zucker Abrams talked about that?
I think they did borrow it as an homage. For those who don't know what we're talking about, in Top Secret, Peter Cushing's cameo character is introduced looking through a magnifying glass, and he has a very big eye as seen through the magnifying glass. But then he moves the magnifying glass away, and the eye is actually just that big.
So I think you just blew my mind again. That was actually Peter Cushing in Top Secret?
Yes, still doing the backwards library sequence.
I did not know that. Of course, that image flashed in my mind like, oh, that was a really good Peter Cushing, probably because that was Peter Cushing.
It was actually Peter Cushing. Yep.
Wow.
And that backwards, where he's like catching the books, throwing the books up into the library. Yeah, no, but I actually hadn't thought of that in years. And when that image came up, I went, oh my gosh, God bless you, Zucker Abrams Zucker.
Yeah, let's see. I think I don't know how much more there is to talk about, except for, I guess the heroines. We talked about the guys a lot in this movie, but the heroines are pretty remarkable too. Despite my issues with her being Victor's cousin, I thought Hazel Court was pretty great. I think Valerie Gaunt made more of an impression on me just because I think she was the more interesting character. Is because she's introduced as quote kind of just the maid, just the help.
Right.
In the first, I think, scene where we see, maybe it's the second scene where we see her and Victor together. It's when Elizabeth has arrived at the house, or maybe it's when Paul comes. I don't remember. Victor walks in. Justine is just off to the side, and he hands her the coat and the hat and something else, but it's almost like he's just putting up on a rack. Like there's no acknowledgement that there's anybody there. He doesn't even say, oh, could you hold this? He doesn't look at her. He just like puts it on her. And so you think, oh, this is going to be a minor character. And then when that affair is revealed, like right after Elizabeth says something like, oh, we're going to be so happy together, or he's the only one for me or something, cut immediately to the two of them, Victor and Justine making out discreetly. Like this movie's going places. And I love it.
Yeah. Hazel Court, because she was kind of the first Hammer glamour offering. You know, as we've noted through other Hammer films, having lovely women in low-cut dresses became kind of a stock in trade. So she was the first of many. And she is one of my favorites. She actually had a fairly decent presence in the genre. She did Devil Girl from Mars back in 1954. And then with Hammer, she also did The Man Who Could Cheat Death, which came in 1961, I believe, 61 or 62. And then she did several films with Roger Corman, his Gothic efforts. He did The Raven and Premature Burial, Mask of the Red Death. But she's just a wonderful kind of, and just a lovely human being. If you ever see any interviews with her, she's just a very, very wholesome and very kind of like, yes, I love doing these movies. I like working with these fantastic actors. I agree with you, however, that Valerie Gaunt is much more interesting as a character and as in terms of a performance. And what's ironic is that this and Horror of Dracula are her only two feature films.
Really? What happened there?
I don't know. I'm not sure what happened. I'm sure one of our other experts that we have in future installments will know. But I looked it up. She didn't pass away or anything. She just looks like she did those two roles and then left the business.
Wow. Well, there is something to be said for making an impact and making a graceful exit, I guess.
Yeah.
Speaking of graceful exits, we got to wrap up here, but we will be talking about more Frank. I think next month we've got a double header. We're going to be talking about another Frankenstein movie and Dracula from Hammer, because those are both 1958. We're going to be comprehensive here in Hammerland. And I appreciate you being my guide, my tour guide through this awesome macabre nightmare of awesome films.
Why, thank you, and I appreciate being given the opportunity, because one of the great things about seeing these films again is imagining you seeing them for the first time. I mean, that really is the excitement.
Well, here's my dream, that because this is a year-long project, that at some point, once this COVID stuff is past, or at least past enough where maybe we can actually get together like the good old days of 2019 and watch movies together. But until then, man, thank you again, and we'll talk soon.
All right. Have a good one.
You too, man. Bye.